Hello, friends, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on designing effective criteria for assessing engineering candidates equitably. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Carrot. The webinar today will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the lead dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the hiring channel. So let's go ahead and get started with some introductions. My name is Jason Wong. I'm a leadership coach and fractional VP of engineering and DEI practitioner with over 20 years of experience in the tech industry. And today I have the honor of being your panel moderator. Speaking of our panel, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. First up, we have Global Head of Solutions Engineering at Carrot, Shannon Hogue Brown. Shannon Hogue Brown started her career writing software over 20 years ago and has moved through the ranks as an engineer and ultimately CTO. She is passionate about improving developer productivity so that dreams and innovations can be built. As Head of Solutions Engineering at Carrot, Shannon works closely with engineering teams to understand their hiring bars, align interviews to them, and create more predictive hiring processes. She currently lives in San Francisco with her two dogs, Seamus and Locke. Next, we have Dominique Simino-Ritchie. Dominique Simino-Ritchie is the Vice President of Engineering at Wealthsimple, a leading Canadian financial services innovator. Wealthsimple makes affordable financial products available to everyone, regardless of their age, net worth, background, or education. Prior to joining Wealthsimple's executive team, she established Lever's first R&D teams outside of San Francisco to build the world's most collaborative recruiting platform. By adopting inclusive practices, she built a team in which 40% of engineers identify as women or non-binary. Prior to Lever, Dominique created and grew successful teams at Shopify and BlackBerry QNX and held various roles at IBM and several startups. On weekends, you can find Dominique creating experimental recipes with whole grains and teaching her kids and others how and why to eat more healthy fiber. Yum. And last but not least, Senior Platform Engineering Director at Tile, Josie Gaines. Josie has spent 20 years in the tech industry as a software engineer, tech lead, and engineering leader at the forefront of emerging technology across Silicon Valley, including engineering manager on Siri at Apple and both principal software engineer and director of engineering at Zynga for a variety of teams. She is currently the senior platform engineering director at Tile, where she's integrating the Tile technology into the 5 billion Bluetooth devices released every year. She's also an advocate for women in the tech industry and actively mentors on the Plato and West platforms. Josie started Women at Siri and leads the Women at Tile Employee Resource Group and Mentorship Program. Great. All right, welcome to all of our panelists. Before we get going, I just wanted to remind everyone that as with all DEI-related discussions, the goal here is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Being a DEI practitioner means constantly challenging ourselves by being curious, doing our own work, and keeping our focus on the larger goal. To paraphrase Austin Channing Brown, this work is about becoming a better human to other humans. Okay, with that being said, let's get down to the business of designing effective criteria for assessing engineering candidates equitably. So, as I think a good way to start here, it's just sort of asking, what are the smells of an inequitable hiring process? Like, how do folks identify if they're doing something wrong? Dominique, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, often it takes a little bit of stepping back to see some of the patterns that you might identify as part of some of maybe the candidate feedback. I think candidate feedback is a really good place to start. And so if you're not seeing consistency across different people that you meet in terms of the competencies that you're evaluating or what you're looking for, vice versa, one place where I've really seen this shine is people who, if engineers are quoting your values and consistently using the names of competencies that are also in their rubrics, then they've really internalized it. So that's like the exact opposite of it. If you're not making offers to people that you enjoyed interviewing and people are saying, like they were really good at communication or they were really good at like telling me about the problem and explaining what I said to them, then you're probably not evaluating them holistically. There's probably some aspect that you're forgetting about. And then I think this for me is a really challenging one, is if you constantly make offers to people at a lower level or salary than they're either getting somewhere else or maybe they currently are. It is expected that we have different levels across companies, but if it's a consistent pattern that you're losing out on great candidates and that they get offers somewhere else at a different level, there's something that you're missing in your evaluation to really differentiate those people.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's all sorts of research out there that shows like under-indexed or underrepresented groups are underleveled and underpaid, which is so important. I also love the point you made about sort of that shared language. And so much of the work that we do is like normalizing and having a common set of language that we all know what we're talking about, which is great. Some of the things that I run into often is uh, I think when I get sort of vague feedback, right? As you're saying, like not something specific or like, you know, this person rubbed me the wrong way, or that ever nebulous, like I wouldn't want to be on a plane with this person for an hour. Those things like totally stick out to me. But thank you. Awesome. Shannon, uh, you know, we're all up here as sort of experts on this topic, but I think it's important for folks to know that we're not perfect, right? We've all made mistakes, myself included. I was wondering if you could maybe share some of the mistakes that you've made in the past as it relates to equitable hiring.
Yeah, absolutely. And gosh, I really hope that people can learn from the mistakes, because I certainly have. You know, I think one of the biggest mistakes was that we were never taught how to interview. You know, as an engineer, you grow up in your engineering career, and interviewing is kind of an afterthought. Someone, knocks you on the shoulder, hey, by the way, can you go meet this person and interview them? I've never been in a situation previously where someone said, hey, let's talk about the competencies that are important, let's talk about the rubric that we need to work with, and so on. Right. And so for me, I think I spent 10 years asking the same 3-part coding question and probably never got a true signal of success on site. I also did some pretty egregious things, to be honest, when I was, a younger leader, brand new to management, enabling my team to go in and to do the things that all of us are talking about today. They would come out and say, oh, I just don't like that person, or they're not going to fit. Or they would do also things like asking people that they didn't like really difficult questions just to get them to leave. And I think, those are just absolutely egregious. And I think these days we know better. And I think it's really important for leaders to train your teams on how to do interviewing. And right now, being remote, I know it's unfortunate, but it's a good time to do that, because you can record your interviews and watch back the interactions that are happening. You can take a step back and figure out, what are the competencies that we look for leveling internally? Okay, let's interview for those, and let's make sure that each engineer knows exactly what they're looking for, and we know what questions they're going to ask, and they have some sort of a rubric, even if it's a checkbox, to do it. So I would say, don't be me, don't be egregious, don't ask the same 3-part coding questions to every single candidate, and certainly don't let your team go in and terrorize candidates. I think we've all learned
Yeah.
from that, but I have a feeling it still happens often.
Oh goodness. I mean, feel like I've lived that parallel life. I feel like I'm in the same boat. I definitely spent the first part of my career asking the same questions over and over again, which were the questions that people asked me when I interviewed, right? Which is that survivorship bias. That's great. Awesome. Thank you. When it comes to sort of implementing changes in the recruiting process, one place to start is sort of with job descriptions, right? Josie, like what are some of the tips that you can give folks about reducing bias there?
Yeah, so, it's really important that we start with the job descriptions. It's really easy to have gendered language that's going to turn some candidates off. Even simple things like using he instead of, he or she or they, right? Using terms such as aggressive, right? But one of the things, that you might have heard is, women are only going to apply to roles when they meet 100% of the requirements. And so your job descriptions, if they have a million must-haves, you're never going to get the candidates that you're looking for, because you're trying to find a unicorn, basically. It takes so much it takes so much time to find candidates. Like, let's make sure that we're actually helping the candidates reach the power that they want, right? And one of the big ones in CS is putting that you need a 4-year degree on there. And guess what? That is actually going to cut off a huge population of people of color by just putting that on there. And you might have a lot of qualified candidates you're just turning down.
Yeah, absolutely. Dominique, what about you?
Yeah, so a wonderful technique that I learned at Lever was the use of impact descriptions. And having just started about 3 months ago at Well Simple, it's been one of the first things that I brought. And I love what you said, Josie, about skill list. I've been challenging managers to just remove skill lists because it's really about helping people envision the impact that they can have in this new role. What will I get to learn? What will I do? And by having managers, so an impact description is where you think about what impact might they have in the first month, the next 3, 4, 6, and year. What would an amazing candidate be able to accomplish in that time? It also helps the manager, the person hiring, remove their own biases about what experience they might need to do that successfully, because it helps them question, like, I need them to be able to build this React framework with components, etc. Well, actually, to have that impact, maybe something else, maybe there's some other skill that they could bring to the table to make that happen. So I think that's a really important thing. And we've had quite a bit of success. The fact is, it doesn't matter if somebody applies and they don't have the skills. It is easy to reject candidates that don't meet them. It is much more difficult to find wonderful candidates that are going to have that added impact and that other, and bring more than what potentially you are even expecting.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that. Something that, that I say all the time is, say you have 5 requirements for this job and one of them is a college degree. If someone has all the other 4 and doesn't have a college degree, would you reject them out of hand? Right. And if the answer is no, then it's not really a requirement, right? Then we're just, we're, we need to change our thinking about that.
Yeah,
Um,
actually add
yeah.
a little bit onto that is also, especially when you're starting to create job descriptions for higher roles in the org, start making sure you're thinking about competencies versus experience, right?
Yeah.
Honestly, it is so depressing to be turned down because, oh, you don't have experience managing X people, right? And it's like, well, I manage this many people and influence this. Like, I have the skills I need to manage that many people. Yet, we really start, especially as people get more specialized, we're really focusing on, have they done this before? And if you do that, you're also going to really be impacting your diversity as well.
It's a little early, but I do want to. There was someone who asked, "Hey, panelists, can you say more about the reasons not to ask the same 3 questions?" Shannon,
Yeah,
could
I'm
you expand a bit more on that?
more than happy to. Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm happy to clarify. What I mean is, it's not, well, first, that those 3 questions probably weren't applicable for the competencies that we were looking for. And throughout the years, the needs of the business changed in my career. I went to different companies. We had different technologies, different kind of conceptual positions, different types of positions that were coming to fruition. I've been in the business about a quarter of a century. So the introduction of DevOps, asking a DevOps person to count the number of lowercase a's in a null terminated string, is probably not the right question to ask them. And so, I think it's really getting back to, it's not necessarily that the questions were bad, just make sure that if you're asking questions, you know how to measure them. And now you know how to apply that rubric and that assessment against the competencies that you're looking for. And most likely things will change in technology over and over and over again in order to do that. Now, genericized questions, and I kind of taking from the last question that we had as well, that's okay. If you want to understand if conceptually people recognize why you have CI/CD tools versus asking a particular syntax on a little CI/CD tool, I think that's a good thing. Just make sure that you understand how to measure it and the competencies that are necessary.
Yeah, I think that speaks to like having intention behind your questions, right? Rather than just the survivorship bias of someone asked me this question, so I'm going to ask it going forward. Great, thank you. One thing I think is that there are folks out there who are trying to do the right thing, right? But they just don't have enough resources, right? I'm thinking about like that 4-person engineering team who's underwater. They're desperately looking to hire, and they're trying to balance doing something like offering a choice between a take-home or an in-person coding session, and it's not something that they can necessarily support. So Shannon, go back to you. Like, what is some advice that you can give folks on that piece?
Sorry, you broke up for a sec for me.
Oh, sorry. What's some advice you can give folks, those small teams that are trying to do the inclusive thing, but just maybe don't have the resources or the time available to to put a truly inclusive interview process out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what's really interesting about smaller teams is that all of the interviewing challenges are magnified on a small team, right? Doing things at scale, it takes consistency and coordination, but building things from the ground up, it actually raises the stakes. I mean, every time one of your engineers is in an interview, that's a quarter of your team potentially who's offline. You absolutely can't have a bad hire because suddenly it's 20% of your developers who aren't meeting the bar, right? So, chances are you probably in those situations have one recruiter given the size of the team. So you need to make the most out of every candidate in your pipeline, and there's no margin for error. So it's exceptionally important to make sure that you have the basics right. You need to know your competencies, agree on a standard scoring rubric, to make sure your questions are mapping to those competencies and they're not bogging you down with noise. So I think it's even more important for the overall feedback is it's even more important and more is at stake for those smaller teams to get it right.
Great. Dominic, so like getting to, how do you design an inclusive interview? Like, how do you choose what criteria to use to assess candidates? Like, what are the structures you put in place? Like, can you help me walk through this?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately your goal is to provide candidates with a really great interview experience that helps them shine. You're not trying to trip them up. You're trying to help them demonstrate what they're most capable of. And so no surprises. You help them come prepared. You actually tell them what to expect when they're walking into the virtual room now these days. You ask them if they need accommodations. So what might be different for them and what may make it possible for them to succeed? In the past, we've provided the pair programming assignment beforehand, even though we didn't usually do that, because for particular people, it made a huge difference in one particular person's case that we've hired. You provide structured interviews so that your interviewers are consistently using the same competencies and the same framework. And ideally, those competencies are coming from your own internal levels so that you're consistent not only with how you're interviewing people, but also how you're evaluating them internally so that they can actually succeed when they join. Because, ultimately that's the whole reason that you're hiring. And then ideally, you're applying feedback, you're asking for feedback, you're learning from your process and consistently improving it.
Yeah. Yes, totally. That through line between like what your interview process looks like and what your performance management and leveling process looks like, I feel like is one of those, when you first recognize it, is like, no duh, like we totally should be aligning these two things. But I think, oftentimes they're just absolutely like ships in the night that just sail past each other. So I think that's super important. Thank you. What one from the folks in the audience, like, how do you handle the first screening process to be less strict and more equitable? Is the answer to put more emphasis and time on that screening process? I imagine this is either the phone screen or the resume screen. Who has thoughts on phone screens and resume screens?
So one of the things I'll take a pass on this one. So one of the things that I think is important is, I've seen a lot of times, somebody reaches out, is interested, and then all of a sudden right away they get sent like a questionnaire or something, right? Without somebody ever really trying to engage in selling this company to the person, right? And so realize, people are busy, right? And this isn't obviously just for, candidates from underrepresented backgrounds, but it really does help there as well, is, take the time to sell your company first. Remember, this is a two-way thing. So start there, like really gauge the interest and treat everybody that way, right? Realize this isn't just like a transaction, and people really do want to understand, hey, is this somewhere where I want to work, right? And so I really try to treat that first conversation. Obviously, I want to understand, like, is this person going to be a good fit for my role? But I also think a big part of that first conversation is also selling like what you have to that other person to see if it's what they want to do, right? So many times we have this preconception and we're just making it a one-way thing. So that would be my one thing I'd comment there. But yeah, going back to the whole structured interview, make sure that you are being consistent with what you're asking, right? There's actually this story that Karen Catlin has in her Better Allies book, where her and her partner actually ended up interviewing for the same job randomly on the same day. And she left the interview going like, wow, these people asked me a bunch of easy questions. Her partner left going like, this was the hardest interview I've ever been through. And it was for the exact same job. And she felt insulted that they basically lowered the bar because she was a woman. And so really take the time to think about that. You know, obviously there's not a lot of cases where you have your partner interviewing for the same job and can actually see this happening. But, you know, it was a really telling story, and it really makes you think about how to set up that structured interview process.
Yeah, totally. That's crazy. Shannon, go ahead.
I know. I was just going to say that completely resonates with me. And, you know, these days there's just a lot of focus on equitable hiring processes. And so it's extremely important. If you don't feel comfortable that you know enough, ask for the training, get the training, because if you if a candidate comes through and they're screened out after just a kind of welcome conversation, they're just kind of left open to interpretation as to why they were screened out in the first place. And that can oftentimes be bad for your business in general. And so not just being a good human being, and please go learn equitable hiring processes and, make sure that you make candidates comfortable. But, this really is a kind of make or break for the industry in general. I guess the second thing for me is just that one of the most important pieces that we learned, and at Carrot we've done, I guess, over 90,000 almost interviews now. And one of the most important pieces that we learned is that we need to get folks in a comfortable and safe mindset, especially people from underrepresented communities. And so that initial screen, I agree with Josie, it really is, it's a sale about your company because it's bi-directional. You can't really, if you're just doing a conversation, you can't completely screen someone out unless there's just no future that they're looking for. So if they're coming in for a developer job and they want to be a product manager in a year, you may not be able to offer that, that's okay. But, really on top of selling your company, get them comfortable, get them in a mindset where it's okay. Ensure that people from underrepresented communities and women in particular who have been conditioned not to ask clarifying questions know that they should be asking clarifying questions as necessary, and that's okay, and it's encouraged. Make sure that they understand the kind of overall format of the environment, the number of folks who will be interviewing them, potentially even the competencies, quite frankly, that they'll be looking for, so that you have somebody who's in a headspace where they can go in, be themselves, get into a potentially normally uncomfortable place, but remember that they're in a safe place, and it's that kind of psychological safety can go a very long way.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot. Yeah, it is. I've had so many experiences in interviewing where, for instance, the feedback about why I didn't move forward was because I didn't understand their product well enough, where their product hasn't launched. Everything I know about the product is what they've told me. And like somehow I don't understand the product. Right. So the way I pay that forward is I try to help interviewers understand, like, we got to meet our candidates on neutral ground. We are 100% in our own worlds. And so we know all the nooks and crannies of our domain, and asking someone about our domain is a little bit like, a skewed test, right? So how do we meet the candidate on neutral ground? So there's not that data asymmetry. So those things. When it relates to that first screen, the other thing I think about is, people's experiences. We've heard like the horror stories, right? Of like companies that only recruit from, one or two schools that have, participated in sports, that, yada, 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 like those ridiculous filters. But the other ways that, that we gather signal could also affect things. So like, if people have short stints, like I've been guilty of like thinking poorly about people with short stints before, and that's not necessarily a lot of that is born out of my privilege, right? Not having an active GitHub, showing sort of a zest for coding, and a lot of times what I tell folks is, those signs could be the signs of great engineers. They could also be the signs of someone who has no external responsibilities other than their job. And is that someone who's going to be able to balance, the trade-offs of work day to day as well as someone else? Think about that. So, anyways, that's moving on. When moving towards like a more equitable hiring process, I think like no matter what level of the org you're at, there's something everyone can do to help, right? So, Josie, what are some ways that folks can contribute to equitable hiring, regardless of where they are in the org chart?
Yeah, and I think this is so important because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if your leadership team is talking about building an inclusive culture and, hiring candidates from underrepresented backgrounds if everyone isn't actually putting in the effort, right? And so, it goes back to a lot of the things that we've actually talked about earlier, right? Taking the time to think about the structured interviews, right? When you're evaluating a candidate and, going out and filling out that feedback form, it's slow down your thinking. Think about what are the biases that I have that I might be introducing as I'm answering these questions. Making sure that you're treating everybody fairly, right? So many times somebody gets declined because they're not a culture fit, but a lot of times that ends up meaning, oh, the person just wasn't like me and wasn't somebody I thought I could just grab a beer with at the end of the day, right? And so we need to slow down and realize, hey, we all have unconscious biases, like all of us do, right? And, like you said earlier, Jason, we all make mistakes, right? And so it's about realizing that this is a journey about learning and really taking the time to incorporate that.
Great. Thank Dominique.
Yeah, I think, something that I really try to emphasize in my teams is that it has to start somewhere. So we might not have a documented rubric today. You may not have a structured interview, but guess what? If you're an engineer and you're walking into an interview tomorrow and you don't have that, here's how you can get started. Go Google what a structured interview is and literally just write it down, put it in a shared open document that every other engineer can read, and then go write down 4 company values and competencies to start with. Start there. And then in the next 4 interviews, refine it, make it better, keep building on it. This is not like this magical solution that comes out of nowhere. When I started interviewing for engineering managers in my last role, I had to start with nothing. And so I took a template, I wrote down how I would introduce myself, how I would make the candidate feel comfortable, what the flow of questions would be. And then I wrote down the competencies I thought I was looking for. And then I interviewed a couple and it turns out that's not what I was looking for. And I built on it. And, it's unfortunate perhaps for those first couple of people that I interviewed, but ultimately in cases where actually I sometimes think I may have missed on someone, I go back. And so it's also about relationship building and how you can build these relationships long-term with people to help them demonstrate the right skills. And then eventually, potentially they end up being a great add to your team.
Yeah. Shannon.
Yeah, absolutely. It is so important for engineering leadership to ensure that you have the right culture to hire folks from diverse backgrounds. I have a non-traditional background. I didn't go to college. Really excited that the folks who gave me a chance didn't take a look at my resume and think that, oh my gosh, I didn't go to college, right? But what I found is that there are a few things. One is if you get your leveling right and the competencies for your leveling right, you can translate that to an interview. You can build out structured rubrics. But if you take a look at your metrics and the data of your entire hiring funnel, and you're starting to see that same person, people are dropping off after their interview with that same person, then you probably have a cultural issue. And that's going to bleed out into your interview process and your hiring processes. And ultimately, why, our jobs hiring folks as leaders is to hire people smarter than us, or give them the tools that they need to be successful, and get out of the way and trust them. And if you've built this culture where those unconscious biases are taking over not just your hiring process but also your meetings, for example, if people aren't aware of their privilege in particular, or even how to work with folks from underrepresented communities or non-traditional backgrounds, then it doesn't matter how polished your hiring process is. You'll still be losing out on incredible candidates. They won't be set up for success. An example of that would be if you're in a meeting, a lot of folks are very comfortable, speaking loudly about their opinions, but you have a whole lot of people in there that you hired for their expertise that you're not hearing. And that's a cultural bias. That's an issue in tech. And so it will bleed into your hiring processes. So my suggestion is always for CTOs and VPs, get the training in place, build that culture from the top down, ensure that you support folks when they're asking for accommodations or training. Be sure to listen loudly, have programs available for folks after they're being hired, give them buddies, and then also audit. Make sure you're auditing your processes, you're auditing your teams, and ensuring that equitable, opportunity is there in your company. And data can tell you all of those things. You can't really hide from data. So take a look at your data, make sure you're doing the right things, and ultimately you'll start to then attract folks from, underrepresented communities. And then you get that culture add and that true value of diversity.
Yeah, and I think that also ties back to our earlier question about sort of job descriptions and how we talk about our culture and how we talk about sort of the job. But I think what I tell a lot of folks is like the way that tech companies are used to talking about themselves are signals to people who are trying to work in tech that don't want to be part of that, right? And so if your language is about meritocracy, if it is about ping pong tables and code ninjas and working late nights and whatever, that is actually gonna bias your population, right? Even though it feels like this might be your version of the greatest place ever. So totally. Another question from one of the viewers out there: how do you handle rubrics when the person doing the interview may not be technical enough to make judgments against a rubric? Dominique.
I assume you're talking about recruiter screens or like that initial step in the process with this question. Probably, I think I'd ask the question of, are you assessing the right thing? Like, do you really need somebody to answer a question that tells you something about some deep knowledge of React that I could go Google, or JavaScript or Ruby on Rails? If you focus on impact, so when you're building your rubric, look for examples. So if I think about, project leadership, let's say, or let me think about something more technical. Think about specific examples where they've demonstrated that leadership. So let's see, I led a technical project where I led the design of it. And that meant that I had to work on the systems, et cetera, and brought people along with me. I think that there's a way to do this from an impact perspective rather than a specific like technical jargon perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Shannon.
Yeah, I completely agree. I want to make sure I give Josie a chance in case. But no, I completely agree. I think we often see that folks are really specific in their filtering questions. They're like, hey, have you worked with, like I said, Jenkins? And do you know what X, Y, Z inside of Jenkins? Or have you built Ruby on Rails apps? And do you understand the impact of Active Record? And what if I want to move to MongoDB? Like, it's those types of questions are extremely limiting, not just from a diversity perspective, but just a general perspective. The types of questions that we've learned, and we've done a ton of external validity studies on the content, are more generalized conceptual questions, which is what I think Dominique and Josie have both kind of touched on. You know, do you understand conceptually the types of questions that you need to ask in order to, you know, build software, to answer a problem, you know, to figure things out? And I also agree that just even showcasing that they have worked in a collaborative environment where they know, okay, I know how to say I don't know. It's okay to say I don't know. I know which questions to ask. I know that I can work collaboratively with, you know, other engineers on answering those questions. It makes a whole lot more sense for ultimately someone who can giving a signal around someone who's going to be successful versus like, hey, by the way, what exactly is the syntax around this particular, you know, functionality inside of this random language? You know, I think on average architectures these days, what, last about 6 months. I don't know, Josie probably knows better than I do, and Dominique, but you know, if your architecture and the technologies that you're using last only about 6 months, why does it matter? You know, again, you're just limiting your pool of candidates and you're limiting the diversity inside that pool.
Absolutely. I think the thing is, like you said, is it safe for candidates to say, like, I don't know? I think a lot about, you know, the difference between like what is rote and what is actually applied, like thinking and like, you know, how do we work in that space? And a lot of the things that I tell when I sort of give orientations on interviewing is, you know, what we want to do is we want to explore someone's knowledge boundaries, right? And we have to figure out like, and so there's a degree to which here are the cold hard facts that we all know around this concept, and then what's the boundary? How do we get to that I don't know boundary? And then, you know, maybe just taking one step further, right? And again, in a safe, comfortable way, like what would happen? Like if we were to make this up, how would it go? And then some of that, like, and then you get to see sort of a shift in thinking, right? And the application of that knowledge throughout. Yeah, the caveat there being, you know, I think over time I've talked to a lot of folks who. And for folks from underrepresented groups, they might not feel comfortable saying, I don't know, right? And so they might not be comfortable showing or saying that thing in person. And so we have to find like ways of doubling down and making it clear. Like the goal of this session is for us to get to a place where we don't know, right? And that's success.
Yeah, and you know, to just add to this, it makes it harder to come up with your interview if you want to do it this way.
Yeah.
This means you actually have to take the time to think about what are good questions, right? And so, you know, this goes back to, you know, even as an engineer, you have the ability to do this, right? And so, hey, before you go walk into that next interview you're going to do, instead of just pulling out like your algorithms question that you usually, you know, pop up, what if instead you come up with like a pair programming problem where you're working together on something that they'd be doing on a day-to-day basis, right? What if you ask them about a problem you solved recently at work? Like that's one of my favorite questions, right? One of my favorite questions at Zynga was actually having people design one of the game features that I built and walking through that, right? And so, you know, it does take time, right? Like to do this successfully, you have to be explicit about it, right? And I think that's the biggest takeaway from today. If like there's one thing you take away is like, you need to be intentional about this.
I'd love to just build upon something that Josie said, which is the helping people demonstrate experience that they've already had. How do you design a more equitable interview process? By not making people prepare to do something that they don't already do every day. And so there's different ways to do that. You could do a systems design interview where you have somebody walk through the design that they had to work on, the actual code, the actual thing that they did previously. And then you get to understand the boundaries of their knowledge and when they chose to stop digging deeper or not. And I've done this in a couple of different ways. You could do that for project leadership as well. You could also have somebody do a code review interview. There are so many things that people do day to day and they've already done that they would be so excited to talk about. And they would walk away from that interview feeling like, wow, I really got to showcase what I've done and what I'm good at and what I'm passionate about, instead of catching them on something else and requiring them to prepare a lot more than needed.
I love that, Dominique. My head is going up and down. I keep saying I feel like a bobblehead every time I talk to you, but but I love that. And in particular, that's so important for new grads, for example, or interns, because, they may not have obviously they won't have the industry experience that you're expecting all the time. And, some of them have been, more fortunate to have access to specific technologies, but it doesn't mean that they're incapable. So having a project discussion and really interrogating to their thought process, how deep they want to go into the problem statement itself, how involved they were in the project, right? That's extremely important. I agree. Once you see the kind of sparks behind people's eyes, then you get really excited. I love that part of the interview where people are talking about their project and they're so excited. They're like, oh, and I spent all of my nights figuring this out. I know early in my career, I had to figure out how to make a butterfly fly. And when I figured it out, it was like direct draw 3. So old school, but like when I finally figured it out, I couldn't stop telling people about it even to this day. And that was about 24 years ago. So I love that part of the business. And it also enables you to really let people shine on the things that they're proud of.
Great. We're got about 5 minutes left, so let's go ahead and keep answering some questions from the folks who are out there. How to get a more diversified pipeline. There's a lot that we can do to make interviewing processes more equitable, but not disadvantage certain groups. But what if you struggle getting those people into the latter parts of the process in the first place? Dominique, do you have some tips on helping folks diversify their pipelines?
Yeah, well, if you're asking this question, you're already too late. You need to be building relationships with people. Hiring is not a one-time event. It is a continuous thing that you do. You build relationships. And if you think about this, if you think about how you grow engineers, part of that is mentorship. And so what are you doing to encourage your own engineers to mentor each other, but then also potentially outside of the organization? I have relationships with managers that we meet on a regular basis. Sometimes they teach me more than I teach them, which I love. And so I think that's one really, really critical aspect, is that you need to start early. And then 2 is you need to be sourcing, looking. I'm always recruiting. If I'm participating in an event or if I'm having conversations with somebody, I'm always thinking, who's that person, and adding them to my pipeline. You need to have that. So you're already asking a great question, because it means you're thinking about it in the right way. You need to start early, not late. The earlier you start, the more likely you'll be successful.
Yes, and I'd love to add to this. There's so many communities out there, right? Like, go partner with Alpha, Women Who Code, Latinas in Tech, Techeria, Out in Tech, Black Tech Pipeline. Like, I could continue like reading a list from the top of my head, right? Like, and there's huge community lists, right? Go partner with them, start forming those relationships. Especially now, do a virtual meetup where you have a showcase of what technology you're working on, so people know what things are out there, right? It's about creating those relationships. This is all about networking and relationships, and it is too late to start when you open that rec. You're already way behind at that point. And people tell me, they're like, oh, but I don't know if I'm going to have a rec open. But guess what? Like, if you're the mobile manager, you're going to be looking for iOS and Android devs at some point, right? So keep looking out for those people while you're networking, socializing. One of the things, obviously we're all remote right now, but one of the things that I really encourage my engineers is there are a lot of conferences that are from, these diverse communities. And so attend those conferences, meet other people there, right? Refer them to your roles. And so I think, and the other thing is, you want to hire people from diverse backgrounds, like, go to the schools where you find them. You want to, go to Atlanta. You want to find more people of color, like, go to Atlanta, go to Baltimore, go to historically Black colleges and universities and recruit there, right? Like, one of the things, so pre-COVID, I actually went and did a college tour and visited Howard, Wellesley, and Vassar, and talked about like the tile technology. And one of the things actually that was really like shocking to me was they're like, nobody ever does this. They're like, they were so thankful that like I was willing to fly out there and talk to them for 30 minutes about what I do. And they made a huge deal out of it because, you know, nobody else is going out there and doing that. And it shocked me. I was like, I don't think I'm like innovating that much here, right? And so, yeah, it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be crazy. Like there's lots of ways to be doing this and creating better pipelines.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And again, the thing I'll add there is like order matters, right? You know, we all, I think for most of us, we think of our talent pipeline as sort of America's Got Talent, right? It's a talent show. You get to see all the acts. And then at the end, you decide which one's the best. That is not the way it works in reality. It is more like an obstacle course. And whoever gets across the finish line first wins, right? And so who gets to start first and making sure everyone gets to start at the same time or a fair shot at starting early influences the outcomes at the end. So I'm going to put that out there. We are out of time. So it's time for us to wrap things up here. Thank you, Shannon, Dominique, and Josie for being a part of this panel today. Thanks to the Lead Dev folks for organizing this event. And thank you to everyone out there watching. The panelists and I will be hanging out in the hiring channel on the Lead Dev Slack if you all want to ask us any questions. Otherwise, be safe out there and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.